Thank you, friends, for joining us this day. We're glad that you are of our number that are interested in the Word of God, to know what the Scriptures say. And we pray that your disposition also is that when you hear what God wishes you to do, that you'll do it. We're studying today from the book of John, the 13th chapter. It is John's account of what is usually called the Two Suppers, or the Last Supper. It was the night in which Jesus was betrayed. It was also the night in which the nation of Israel was celebrating the feast called the Feast of the Passover. It was at this feast that Jesus and his disciples remembered that ancient years before, 1,500 or more years, in which that God had delivered the people of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. And Jesus was about to institute another supper in which that men would not be reduced from the bondage of mankind, but from the bondage of sin. And it was a fateful night. Now, all of the other apostles or the other Gospels record in great detail these two suppers. But John does not do so. He doesn't tell how they came to be about in the place where they were. He doesn't tell about many of the other details. He, in fact, does not even really talk about the giving of the Last Supper. But what he does do is does that which he does so well, and that is that he records for our edification and for our benefit something that none of the other of the gospel writers revealed. And that was that Jesus did one of the greatest acts of humility. He, their Lord and Master, stooped down and washed their feet. Then we look at Jesus washing their feet. It came after the observance of the supper. And during that interval, Jesus took off his outer garments. He got a basin of water and took a cloth and began to wash the disciples' feet. Surely a great hush must have fallen over the multitude, these disciples, as they saw what Jesus was about to do. They sat in silence, apparently, until Jesus approached Peter. And Peter said, "Lord, what are you going to do?" Jesus said, "I'm going to wash your feet, Peter." Peter said, "No, Lord, you're not going to wash my feet." Jesus said, "Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you don't have part nor lot in this matter with me." He said, "Well, then, Lord, don't just wash my feet, but wash my hands and my head also." And Jesus said, "He that is bathed hath no need of cleansing save his feet." And then he said, "Now you're clean, but not all." And so Jesus did this act of humility, showing to the disciples something that they likewise must do. He said, "If I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you need to wash one another's feet." He wasn't giving them a religious act to do. He was giving them a lesson in that even the most feeble task and the weakest and smallest task and the most humblest task they were to do to others who needed them. They were to be servants. But when we find that Jesus had taught them the lesson, then he made this statement. He said, "Verily I say to you, that one of you shall betray me." And the disciples were stunned at that. Now Jesus had already intimated that already in the supper, because when he had finished washing their feet, he had said, "Now you're clean, but not all." Because there was a man that might be clean as far as his feet and his body was concerned, but his heart was dirty. And that man would later be discovered as Judas. The disciples were stunned, and they began to say and ask themselves and ask the Master. He says, "I." And then finally Peter said to John, "Ask the Master who it is." And so John asked Jesus, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus said, "It is he for whom I shall dip the sop and give it to him." So he dipped the sop and he gave it to Judas and then said, "What thou do quickly." And so Judas went out into the night, and the record said it was night. When we Look at Judas. We think about Judas and Peter. Both of them were chosen by Jesus to be his apostles. And both these men had heard the teachings of the Master. They had seen his marvelous works. And not only had they heard his teachings, but they'd followed him. But now, here's a choice that Judas must make, and equally so a choice that Peter must make. Now, as Jesus washed their feet, came to Judas, think about this man. Here was a man that was chosen by Jesus to be of that special number. He had a special place. And here was a man that had heard the marvelous teachings of Jesus, his parables, and the different times in which that he had engaged in sessions with those that were the teachers, and he showed them their falseness in their doctrines whenever that falseness arose. And here was a man that not only heard the marvelous teachings of Jesus dispel those that argued against him, but they'd watched his miracles. They'd seen many miracles. And here was a man that sat and knew all of those things. And here he comes, knowing full well what he's about to do in just a few hours, that he's going to betray this one that had taught him and had given him many lessons and blessings. He was going to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. Surely his heart must have smote within him as he thought about what he was about to do. Must have pricked him. But there was a love in Judas for something that was greater than Jesus. And that love that he had was for money. He displayed that lust already 5 or 6 days earlier. Jesus had been given a feast in Bethany. It was apparently a feast of appreciation for the deed that Jesus wrought when he raised Lazarus from the dead. All of the good people were there, and Lazarus was there as a guest at the table. Martha, the sister of Lazarus, was there serving, and Mary, also the sister of Lazarus, was there. And in the midst of the feast she came, and she brought a gift. It was a gift of precious ointment, very costly. And she anointed Jesus with that costly ointment. The disciples criticized her, namely, Judas criticized her, because Judas was one that said of her, why was this ointment wasted? It could have been sold for 300 pence and given to the poor. But the divine commentary was this. He said this not because that he cared for the poor, but he was a thief, and he carried the bag. He was the treasurer, and he stole what was in it. So he betrayed already the lust that was in his heart. And he had already coveted with the chief priests and the rulers that he would betray the Master for 30 pieces of silver. As we look at this, we remember something. And we remember what Paul would later write. As he wrote to Timothy, he said, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, which some reaching after have been led astray from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. That was certainly demonstrated in Judas. His lust for money led him to this act of betrayal. That is that so terrible. One that feigned to be a friend of the Master, but by a kiss that he bestowed upon him, betrayed him to his enemies that would lead him out and crucify him. And Judas, his heart smote him. It was that later on, after he'd done it, he thought about it. Now, people have discussed, why did Judas do it? And there is this theory among some that Judas, knowing the nature and the character of Jesus, thought, this man will never be condemned. He is innocent. He's pure. The world knows him as a godly man. They won't crucify him. They'll set him free. And I'll be 30 pieces of silver better off. It didn't turn out that way. He betrayed his hands, Jesus, into the hands of men that were just as wicked as he. They had Jesus in their clutch, in their hands, and they intended to kill him. Nothing was going to stop it. And that's what they did. And when Judas saw that he was betrayed, finally, he came. And he came to the chief priest and said, here's your money back. I've sinned. I betrayed innocent blood. They said, what's that to us? See thou to it. And Judas went out and he hung himself. When we look at Judas, we find he'd made a choice he later regretted, but a choice that he did not seek the forgiveness of the master from. And as we look, we find two choices. And as we look at the choice, we find the choice that Judas made was that brought about not only his physical death, but his eternal ruin. The Bible said that I'm going to be betrayed. Good word for that man that does that if he'd never been born. The Bible said that Judas, by transgression, failed, that he might go to his own place. On the other hand, we find another man that failed. His name was Peter. And Peter had listened to the Lord. He thought that he had greater strength than what he actually manifested. And that night in which Jesus told the disciples about the betrayer, he also said, all of you are going to betray me tonight. You are going to desert me, rather. And Peter said, not me, Lord. I never will betray you. Though all these other men betray you, I never will. And Jesus said, Peter, this night before the cock shall crow, you will deny me 3 times. Peter didn't think so. But then they took Jesus, and the disciples, as Jesus had predicted, forsook him and fled. Peter was one that went away with the others. When he was put in the high priest's house, they were beginning to question him. The servant girl that admitted him to the house of the high priest said, surely you're one of his disciples. He says, no, I'm not. And another said, didn't I see you in the garden with him? And he said, no. And then as he stood around the fire, warming himself by those that were there, they said, surely you're one of this man's disciples. You're a Galilean. Your speech betrays you. And he did the most detestable thing. He cursed. He swore. I don't know the man, he said. Scarcely had he finished his denial that the rooster crowed. Oh, how recollections of what Jesus said come flooding back into his heart. And not only did he hear the rooster crow, he looked across the courtyard to where Jesus was standing. And Jesus had turned and looked at him. And Peter went out and he wept bitterly. Now, momentarily, he left with the other disciples. But he'd not forgotten the things Jesus taught him, nor had he lost his conviction that Jesus was who he confessed him to be, the Christ, the Son of the living God. He stayed with the disciples during the 3 days in which Jesus was in the tomb. And then when the news came that Jesus has been risen, his tomb is empty, Peter, along with John, ran to the tomb and saw it, wondering. And that same day, Jesus met the disciples who were gathered together, 10 of them. And he spake to them. He allowed them to touch him. He ate with them. Thomas wasn't there. And he said, I won't believe until I touch the place in his hands where the nails were and where the sword, the spear, thrust into his side. A week later, Thomas had that chance. He was gathered with all of the apostles. And Jesus appeared again. And he was invited to do what he had said that he must do, to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. Seeing Jesus and hearing him say, come, Thomas, touch the places in my hands where the nails pierced them. Thrust your hand into my side. Be not faithless, but believing. And Thomas said, my Lord and my God. And he said, Thomas, because you've seen me, you believe. And blessed are they that have not seen me, believe. And so during that 40 days that Jesus continued to teach his disciples, Peter was there. He was listening. And the Lord had appeared to him on that day personally, and then talked with him during the days that they were in Jerusalem, and then they retired to Galilee. And there Jesus saw them again. But then he had commanded them to go back to Jerusalem and wait in the city till they be endued with power from on high. So they did return back to Jerusalem. And Jesus continued to talk with them. And he was with the disciples when they were on that mount and saw him ascend back to the Father. And Peter, guilty of denying the Lord, shamefacedness, turned an about face. He was with them. And on the day of Pentecost, he was one that stood up and bravely preached the gospel of the resurrected Christ. The book of Acts records 3 different times in which that Peter had been in prison, of the punishment and of the persecution that they'd received. We find that Peter was one that published the gospel far and wide. And though he was not immune to making mistakes again, for he did, he always lifted himself up, sought the forgiveness of the Lord, and obtained it. We look at Peter, and we find him writing his letters of encouragement to us, to add to the Christian graces, that it might be supplied unto us an entrance into the eternal kingdom. And we hear him reminding his readers that the Master had said, Peter, when you were young, you went where you want to. But now when you grow old, you're going to be bound and led by another, go where you don't want to go, signifying by what means he would die. And that time did come. And Peter did die for the Lord. 2 men, 1 teacher. They heard his messages. 2 of them that heard him had choices to make. And they made different choices. And they went to different destinations. Now, friends, the Lord doesn't want anyone to perish. He doesn't want you to. But you're a free moral agent. You have the right to say yes to the Lord, and you also have the right to say no. But remember, when you say no to the Lord, there will be consequences for it. Serve the Lord. Obey his will. Do what he said in Mark the 16th chapter. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. And do that which Paul later said, that be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know your labor is not vain in the Lord. And do that which Jesus wrote to one of the 7 churches when he said, be thou faithful unto death, I will give thee the crown of life. May God bless you to be a faithful, diligent servant of the Lord, loving him, loving his word, and longing for his second coming.